I want to go to the root and identify the fundamental differences that I see in America today. The two parties defined by basic fundamental moral and philosophic principles. The first philosophy, the first party, can be summed up in these words. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Now, of course, these are the words of the Declaration of Independence. This teaching, the teaching of the Declaration, says that each individual is self-owning, self-governing, self-reliant, and self-fulfilling. It says that men and women have a right to be free, free to pursue their individual happiness. In other words, it upholds a moral philosophy of rational self-interestedness. And it upholds a political philosophy of laissez-faire capitalism as both right and good. It says that each man has a right to live for his own sake and to pursue his own interests and his own happiness, and that he ought to be the beneficiary of his own ideas and actions. Now, this philosophy, the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence, says that you should not sacrifice your life for the sake of others, nor should you ask others to sacrifice their life for yours. This philosophy says no sacrifice. Now, the philosophy of the second party, I think, can be summed up in these words. Quote, "From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs." Now, you might know that these, of course, are the words of Karl Marx. And this is the moral philosophy of self-sacrifice. And it is the political philosophy of socialism. The doctrine of socialism says that all individuals, regardless of ability and productivity, should be made equal. That they are endowed by the government with certain unalienable rights, among which are the rights to food, clothing, shelter, health care, education, old age pensions, etc., and whatever else the government says or tells us is our need. The doctrine of socialism tells us that the talented and hardworking should be forced to work for those who aren't or don't. The philosophy says that each man has a moral duty to sacrifice his life, his liberty, his property, and his pursuit of happiness. Which of these two philosophies do you think is most dominant in today's America? The answer, I think, unfortunately, is clear. It's the second. It's the Marxian. Our culture upholds a moral code of self-sacrifice and a political philosophy of socialism as its highest ideal. Consider for a moment how America's businessmen and women are typically treated in our culture, in particular in the elite culture. According to America's elite culture, according to the New York Times and CNN, what is the cause? And who are we to blame, for instance, in the current financial crisis? Answer: it's unregulated, laissez-faire capitalism. That's the cause. That's the economic cause. And the villain is that fat cat Wall Street businessman. But that's not good enough. According to our elite culture, according to the mainstream media, there is a deeper cause to the financial crisis, a moral cause. And the true villain of the current financial crisis, according to the mainstream media and to the elite culture, can be summed up in one word: greed. Right? That's what it's come down to. According to the mainstream media, that's the cause of the financial crisis. There is no consideration at all in the mainstream media that the true cause of the current economic crisis is in fact not economic, it's political. Right? They never consider the possibility that the cause of the current financial crisis has to do with government legislation that has been passed over the course of the last 30 years. They have nothing to say, for instance, about the Community Reinvestment Act. They have nothing to say about the creation of the Federal Reserve. They have nothing to say, right, about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The fact of the matter is that America's elite culture is openly antagonistic to business and to businessmen and women. Now, as I'm sure you all know and know all too well, businessmen and women in this country are typically portrayed as villains in our movies, in our TV shows, in our newspapers, our novels, on the nightly news, from our pulpits, and in the classrooms of our elementary schools, and most importantly, in our universities. In fact, the American CEO is America's only unadulterated bad guy, the only pure villain. Now, how many times in the last year have you heard about American politicians how many times have you heard American politicians refer to bankers and businessmen and women as greedy? Right? How many times have you seen Barney Frank, demand that an American businessman go before a congressional committee and be denounced by people like Barney Frank as immoral, as greedy? Right? It happens all the time. According to Hollywood, businessmen and women are the most immoral individuals in America. For instance, who does Hollywood always portray as the bad guy in its movies? Right? Is it Osama bin Laden? No. The bad guy, 90% of the time in America's Hollywood movies, is always the greedy businessman. And who does Hollywood portray as exploiting, for instance, the poor and the weak? Answer: it's always the greedy American businessman.